Hello and welcome to another episode of the Rippling Pages podcast with me, Liam Bishop, and today I'm joined by James Clarke. He grew up in the Rossendale Valley, situated near Greater Manchester and the Pennines. The industrial and post-industrial towns of the north are often a constituent element of his novels. Whether it's the Yorkshire mining communities in his first novel, The Lytton Path, that also won in the Betty Trask Prize, or whether his second novel, Hollow in the Land, that M. John Harrison described as contrasting between fantasy and realism. They flicker like the lights on the abandoned quarries, the ailing sawmill, the dingy pub. Likened to John McGregor, James's new novel, Sanderson's Isle, might join fans of Ballad with its focus on a young man's speak, searching for his father under the wing of a mercurial, drug-fueled TV presenter called Sanderson. We start in London before we move to the Lake District in this chaotic quest. James, welcome to the Rippling Pages podcast. This is my second episode in a row, actually, with Lancashire. We had Blackpool last time, and we're back in Lancashire. So, any Yorkshire listeners knowing that I'm obviously from Leeds, Yorkshire, do forgive me. But
yeah, cheers for having me on.
All right, let's
Lancashire as well.
Let's get straight into it. So the novel's called Sanderson's Isle. We don't meet Sanderson at first, but he's obviously a very important character. Can you just tell us who Sanderson is and why our narrator is so compelled by him?
Sanderson is basically a failed writer and a literary critic and TV presenter who's fallen into a kind of reluctant fame via the BBC. He's written a book that's taken him into this position where he's ended up presenting this almost like a country file of its time. And he's based loosely upon, behaviour-wise, upon the artist Francis Bacon, who lived a pretty dissolute life in and around Soho in the 60s. And he's based also upon the writer Ian Nairn, who was an architectural critic of the mid-20th century, basically, who was a big-time drinker and was always sounding off against the establishment, and was just a really ebullient and very brilliant individual. There's also an element to Sanderson where he's sort of like this pivotal figure within a countercultural scene in and around the sort of King's Road, which was a big area in the 1960s at the time for like a lot of like the hippie movement, sort of like countercultural figures used to like revolve around there, and that's where Sanderson is sort of situated. And the novel is narrated by a sort of outcast named Thomas Speake, who's journeyed down to London on a quest to try and find out who he is, really, to find his father, and he runs into Sanderson purely by mistake, really, and then he falls into his orbit, and then the sort of the charisma of the man and his status and who he is and the way he interacts and I guess belittles Tom is something that it really drives the book.
Yeah, 100%. And I wanted to start with Sanderson because his presence is kind of felt even when we haven't met him. There's this sense that this narrator, Thomas Speake, is finding someone, even though he's found his father, but he's looking for someone. He's looking for some kind of figure that's missing in his life, and it becomes Sanderson. And what is it then in that initial meeting? I don't know if you could tell us a little bit about that initial meeting that they have, and why it is that the narrator Speake wants to go on this quest with him.
Speake basically travels to London, as I said, to try and track down his long-lost father. He's an illegitimate. He's been the result of an affair at a hospital, and so that's taken place in the 30s. And as a result of that, being a product of this affair, found himself dropping out of society. He's basically unaccepted everywhere he goes, purely by the advent of his birth. Never mind that he's northern working class. He's got this sort of slightly foreign perspective, like outlook to him. He looks a little bit unusual. He doesn't know where he comes from. So he goes down to London to try and get a kind of like a read on that, because he's just been dislocated and knocking around for years and years and years as a drifter. He then basically arrives at a house in Chelsea where he thinks his father's going to be. The father is not there, but Sanderson is. So what he finds in his search for a father is not the man himself, but it's a father figure. And then they basically run into each other a little bit later on that night after a combustible first meeting, when Speake is looking over the wall of the garden and he catches Sanderson up to no good. And Sanderson sort of chases him out of town. And they run into each other again later at a pub. And then from that point on, they just sort of start to try and work each other out, figure each other out. And I guess the book is all about that idea about like we are all essentially alone. And as a bit of a depressing thought, I guess, but it's about the essential tragic solitude of our condition. And both of these characters, as all the characters in the book, are undergoing that sense of realization and feeling of it. And if they haven't realized it, they've felt it. It's kind of about like that prelapsarian feeling of recognizing and knowing that who you are and what you are. They're kind of like trying to push and pull at each other, Sanderson and Speak, to try and understand each other the whole time, and neither of them is able to do so. It's about belonging, trying to define yourself, even if to define yourself is in opposition to something else.
So to pick up on that final point, and why, and you spoke about in Nairn and Francis Bacon and their kind of personalities, why was it that particular dynamic then that you thought was most appropriate to explain that?
Well, Bacon was all about, I mean, if you look at a lot of his artwork, they're all a bit of an existential scream, aren't they? And they're kind of about that idea about being trapped and trying to express yourself as you can through that notion of being trapped, and that wheat paste and cut and paste like formulation of an identity. And that is kind of like you're in opposition to something at all times. You're like trying to find your way out of yourself and express yourself. And you do that in everything you do. You're always trying to find some degree of self-expression. And it often is in opposition to the social circumstances of your time. Or it might be in social. By social, I don't just mean out and about on the street. I do mean within your family as well, because there's always a social dynamic within that too. I think that Thomas Speak has always experienced that. He was, as I say, was the product of this affair in a hospital, and then as a result, it's been rejected by his mother, but still been raised by her on the premise of a lie where she's told him that she's his aunt when in fact she's actually his mother. And then he's also been palmed off on other people. So he's always fallen out of every single power structure that he's involved in. And he's always pushed out and made and rejected everywhere he feels. He doesn't have that. He never had those things you need as a kid, right? You need love, you need care, you need affirmation, boundaries, validation. And he never had any of those things. And I guess Sanderson has never either. Each man sees in the other a kindred spirit to a certain extent, as well as a son, as well as an experiment.
Take us then on a little bit of their journey, where Sanderson and Speak going, and where they're going, and kind of what the purpose of that is, because it's quite a distinct purpose.
Speak basically, even when he meets new people, they're trying to ask him where he's from, who he is, what he does. They're kind of taking the piss out of him, and he doesn't really know why. And he embarks upon what is essentially a series of quests. The first being this aforementioned search for his father. He also is the other quest is his attempts to seduce his landlady. The third quest beyond that is basically to evade the law following a disastrous accident that occurs right at the start of the book, which sort of powers a lot of his behavior. And then this accident basically compels him into the arms of Sanderson as a means of escape. So Sanderson becomes not only a surrogate father figure, not only a way to define himself and belong, but also a vehicle with which he can evade the authorities following something that Thomas does right at the start of the book. And from there, Speak finds a pretext to find that notion of belonging, to define himself within that notion of belonging, and to potentially get himself out of his social situation that he's currently stranded in, because he has nothing. But by embarking upon this mission with Sanderson, he can define himself and gain something. And that mission is ultimately to find a young boy who is in a hippie, who's been hiding out in a hippie commune up in the Lake District.
There's a lot going on. There is, and it is obviously a very serious novel. And some of the very, you've given us an insight into the, serious themes, but it is a lot of fun. But it also calls to mind these kind of road trip novels, and especially of that era, the 60s era, drug fueled sort of road trips. I think Kerouac does get mentioned in there, doesn't he? But there's even something of, I don't know if you would agree with this or not, but I was sort of reminded of Humbert in a way, which is a road trip novel. Slightly dark, insidious nature that sort of compels people to be taken, go with, people like Sanderson, albeit not on the kind of grand scale that Humbert was.
I wanted to write an adventure basically that still had something to say. So although I've like brought in Francis Bacon and Ian Nairn and all these lofty ideas, it's kind of like it's a blackly comic existential thriller basically, where they embark upon this mad quest. And I guess there's a bit of a with Nail and I element to it. It's like, the what's it, that Terry Southern book, The Magic Christian, it's been compared to of late, which a good book that I read actually that really inspired me was and it's very different, but it was The Sisters Brothers by Patrick DeWitt that would seem to me a similar sort of vein, where it was on the face surface of it, it's an adventure about two brothers in the Wild West trying to track something down, going on a quest. But it's also about that fraternal rivalry, the need to belong or not, and about the hollow nature of seeking gold. Because in that, the two brothers, like they're seeking someone out who's basically managed to achieve the holy grail of alchemy, and I loved it. And I wanted to write something that was able to achieve. I wanted to have a similar achievement, basically.
It's that kind of lawlessness as well that seems to inspire these stories. They're not people just going on a road trip usually. There's kind of lawlessness too, and that comes from a lot of things, doesn't it? That you've spoken about, the kind of drug filmness of it, the kind of outsiderness, the kind of vagrancy of it. Why is it usually lawlessness that surrounds these trips? I guess you can't answer for everyone, can you? But
no, but there does seem to be a common denominator in lawlessness, because or a need to escape, or a need to go and shape the snow globe, I suppose, and just like emerge as a new self in some regard, which a lot of literature shares as a central theme. I find they tend to they shrug off the shackles and they go out into a new wilderness, a new unknown, I guess, to try and find something new and wonderful. And what they discover usually tends to be nothing except themselves, but which is a discovery in itself. And I guess, like in Sanderson's Isle, they go from the city to the country, and that's always been a part of my books to a certain extent, where like the power of the metaphorical power, I should say, and the physical power of the outdoors and what it represents. Because in the city you've got the imposition, haven't you, of society, like and work, the dehumanizing like toad, as Philip Larkin said, of work, squats on you with all its rules, and you got all that overwhelming lack of space in the city, and like the decaying of industry, and like at the same time that excitement and that energy and that possibility and the human interaction, all that is to be left behind when you go to the outdoors. Like I guess my first book, right, was The Lytton Path, and that was all about a family involved in the mining strike in 1984. But that was about the need to escape, use the countryside for escape, and like the idea of irretrievable change, I suppose. And the second book was a novel in stories, all about people in a valley, like lodged in a valley, effectively, a hollow place, and how in that place you are subject to stasis and like cyclical patterns of behavior that you will always keep returning to and repeating ad infinitum. And then this new book, Sanderson's Isle, is about like the vulnerability of your position and the idea of alienation and loss that is like put into hyper focus on a mountainside.
In Leeds on the 27th of July, I'm going to be in conversation with poet and previous guest on the Rippling Pages, Charlie Bayliss. get your tickets, go to charliebaileysleeds.eventbrite.co.uk. That's charliebaileysleeds.eventbrite.co.uk, or find a link in the show notes. So in Sanderson's art, the characters they go to the Lake District, don't they? And they're kind of traveling around the lakes, but he doesn't do all these kind of traces of humanity. They find things that are kind of man-made. And there's a point at where I think it's Sanderson says, do traces of people get left behind in materials? Are there residual sounds and shared experiences, links between past and present packed within the fabric of our daily surroundings? Are they trying to escape, or are they looking for something still?
They're always looking. And I guess as time goes on and we move further and further away from what the world was into like the Anthropocene, where everything has been affected by people, everything, like you're always looking for new things, but all you will find is traces of former people having the same searches and thinking similar thoughts to you. I guess in that time, like that passage you just described is where takes place in a nuclear bunker, the tail end, the bloody dregs of an acid party, basically. Yeah, and I guess you always get, if anyone has ever done hallucinogenics, it's always an element of clarity will appear and starting to question your surroundings somewhat. And that's exactly what the character does in the moment. He starts to think about like what came before, what went into what is.
But you kind of alluded to it there, the sort of drug fuelness of this trip, and there's kind of trips within trips, really. I don't know why was it important to have this kind of drug fueled element to the novel?
You think of the 60s and you think of acid, but beyond that idea of psychedelia, what is it that you get from psychedelia? It's basically about a radical change in perception and to become attuned with your surroundings and with the people you're engaged with, and to like you sort of become attuned to like a higher. It sounds a bit there for everybody. It's a higher power in a certain sense. That's what it kind of feels like. So I guess I wanted to talk about that idea about changing the way you view things and changing the way you look at things, and how through drugs you find out a lot about you. You find out new things about yourself through drug taking. You can do, famously, and it's just all about looking at the country in a new way, this book, and it's about using micro moments in historical points in time to talk about like the present. So like a device like an acid trip where you shake up your perception and the way you see things, like you see things in a whole new ball game, and that's ultimately what my books are trying to do. Like kind of sound off about the political present and the situations that people like Thomas Speake find themselves in. The notion of like psychedelia and drug taking is kind of like, again, it's metaphorical, and it also enables the characters to undergo moments of like visionary awareness and transcendence as well.
Well, I guess what came first in the sort of the genesis of the novel, was it this idea then that it had to be set in the 60s to sort of provoke that, or was it more was it in these sort of two characters, Sanderson and Speake, to make those comments that you are making on today, if you will?
It became important to me because I thought the 60s was a good indicator of when things started to sort of go into a bit of a tailspin. So after the war, you basically had the building of the state, building of the NHS, for example, and building all the social housing and all that sort of like the new towns that were built around in the UK, and it was like trying to like do things for other people. After the war, everything had been so fucked up that like it seemed like people came together to sort it all out. Like, let's do this as a form of utopia. Yeah, and in the 60s it started, like the buildings started to crumble, and like there's the old tune about the day the 60s died, I guess, and it's like sort of went into the drabness of the 70s, and then we ended up with Thatcherism, and that, we all know what happened after that. So I guess like that's why I wanted to look at that time, because it was a time when people were trying to do things a bit differently, and you also had that tune in dropout mentality where like people were starting to live communally, and they were like again shake up the perceptions about how things need to be. There was like they were like it's peace and love, wasn't it? That's not wrong. That is a good ethos, and also like being more attuned to the land and living, and like shaking up the norms of what a family structure is and what a social structure is, and like all these things. There were ideas that were considered in that time, I guess, and they got poo-pooed because they weren't buying into the dominant power structures of the time that we then follow to this current predicament, as I see it, really.
It feels like these structures are crumbling, and it feels a bit like a metaphor for that we're kind of crumbling.
If you comment on the days to come, like all my books are basically moaning in a way, moaning about the state of things, but trying to look for answers as well. It's probably futile, but at least it's good. It's an exercise in utopianism for me.
I don't know if it's futile, but people hearing this who might not have read your novels before. I'm sure that we've got a fair few fans as well, but I think someone coming into this, I think there's a perception of this kind of northern writing, disassociation of sort of grittiness that really sort of grinds upon me sometimes. This perception of people who write about the North and what it was like to live sort of through those periods, inequality essentially. But you are incredibly lyrical, and the image is incredibly important to you. It's a really powerful combination, I would say, that kind of lyricism for that kind of subject matter.
Power of language to concoct that free image is unparalleled, and I think you just need to like know how to use it and wield it at the right time. Which I guess if you were to read all three of the books, you'd probably see an evolution in trying to control it a bit more, which is the nature of all artists and writers. Like you're always trying to hone your craft, aren't you? And voice as well, and writing with a bit of welly. But I guess there's a real trend with a lot of spare prose styles, and that is great, but it's not really me. I write from lived experience would be a better way to put it, I guess. And because I do that, it gives it, I guess, that more of that personal character and flavour. All my favourite writers have done that. I'm a massive fan of Lucia Berlin. It was her collection Manual for Cleaning Women was only re-released a few years ago.
Yeah, I remember that.
Yeah, so then it's like absolutely just like shook me up. I loved it. It's amazing. It's an amazing book. And she wrote similarly, just from you're reading her stories, and they're just like written in Technicolor. And I'm just like, it makes my head pop, and that's what I'm aiming for with everything I write. I want to be shit. I want to be moved. I want to have someone who's written from the heart. You know what I mean? Like not necessarily just like so staged and poised and thinking about everything in this very, very clear crystal manner. I mean, do think clearly and like with clarity, but like also don't forget to just like chuck some coal in the fire, or and just like really get with energy.
Is that a kind of statement that you're making, or do you think there's not enough of that, or?
Do you know what? Yeah, I do think there's not enough people. I think a lot of people write from their head and they don't write from their heart. Relying too heavily on the idea rather than what the emotion is can be a bit constricting.
The trajectory of the novel is. I don't want to say that you wouldn't anticipate it, but it does. It only extends, doesn't it? It gets more intensified. They don't retreat from sort of where it's taken.
I take the book from a journey to find himself in London to a point of self-acceptance in a very remote place where things shouldn't make sense but somehow do for him, and the character undergoes a profound psychedelic experience, essentially, that helps him to reevaluate and come to terms with the inequalities and biases and unfortunate occurrences that have befallen him and that he's brought upon himself. But in so doing, it brings about his own ruination.
They find this is a novel full of lost people, and they find more. Well, I don't know. Do you characterize the people in this commune lost, or?
I characterize them as found, but at the same time, these things are only temporary. Not to say that sounds quite pessimistic, I suppose. Like, it's always we're in a perennial state of being lost and found all the time. When I was reading about communes, which I did a lot of documentaries about people who are doing it, I mean, the very few of these people who lived that life are still living it, but they all remember it well. They remember the feeling and what it was and the rules that happened and where the actual human nature came through. But yeah, he basically, the characters find themselves in this new society out in the wilderness, basically, and in these new places, anything can happen.
Where would they be now then? If what kind of lives would they be living now, do you think?
Well, if they're still alive, which they might not be, because in terms of like the years advancing, I like to think Sanderson will be some kind of Joe Sanderson, the esteemed writer, critic, and TV presenter, will be a part of the furniture, a fondly remembered talking head upon documentaries, and maybe write that book that he's always alluded in that everyone would always adore him for. But I doubt he would have written it. And speak himself, I imagine that I'd like to think he's found a sense of peace that eludes him for much of the novel until right at the end when he when it sort of rises out of the stars for him. I hate judging characters. I think like you have to have respect for people's like origins and like where they came from, who they are, whatever they are. Even if they made like bad choices like he does in the book. I mean, he does, he's a guilty person. He commits crimes within the book, but you never want to judge him, because I mean, every person who's ever done anything, there was a reason for it.
No, absolutely. And it's I think that's kind of what helps with the sort of tone, the voice of it. You buy into it, don't you? You buy into that narrative arc. Otherwise, making judgments too early. It inhibits that journey that you take with them, and it's how he sort of goes along with. There's so many secrets, I think, in the novel.
Yeah,
in the form of that, and it's how he goes along with someone else's sort of secret and kind of guilt about withholding his true intentions.
It is about the secrets we're keeping inside ourselves and how we're all trying to access everyone else's secret. And even if when you get to the bottom of it, it might not be all that, which is a disappointment you have to face. But you want it to be fun. The journey and the search is what makes it so much fun.
It's that kind of belief in a revelation, is it? If we get that, there's something's going to click at some point, and that's going to reveal everything we thought we kind of needed to know about ourselves.
It is all about a search for revelation. Always, and then you get a revelation, and it's like, oh,
yeah, there's not that big insight, is there?
What the fuck's this? Like, then they go on elsewhere. That's why he thinks like Rob is going to be a way out of his situation, but it's not. He thinks that going to a party and inveigling his way into like this guy's world is going to be a way out of his situation, or just something to do. It's not. Yeah. It is, but it isn't.
Sanderson's Isle is out on the 13th of July. James Clarke, though, it's been an absolute pleasure talking to you about it. And when it's out, go and buy it. But for now, James, it's been a pleasure. Thank you.
Nice one. Thank you.
Thanks again to James for joining me on the Rippling Pages podcast. And of course, my thanks to you for joining me as well. Next time, I'm going to be joined by Nairn Parks, and we're going to be talking about Azuka, his new novel from P. Peltry.